Great. Thanks for joining us today. We're with Mary Nolan and Chris Smith, who are running for Metro District 5. And would just like to get started perhaps by having each of you introduce yourselves and say why you're running and why you believe that you're the better candidate for this position. And how about if we start with you, Chris?
Okay, great, thank you. Well, unfortunately, we find ourselves in a time of crisis. And in fact, we have layers of crises going on right now. We have a racism crisis that's been 400 years in the making, and that I think, fortunately, we now, many of us have a new awareness of and are willing to deal with in ways we haven't before. We have a climate crisis that's been 100 years in the making, and that we're seeing the effects play out in the wildfires last week, becoming more and more urgent that we deal with it. And we have a housing crisis that's been brewing for several decades as the federal government has disinvested and left cities and regions to deal with it. The solutions to those crises are going to be intersectional. We can't take them one by one. We have to deal with them as a group and look at the places where they interconnect. I think I'm in an ideal position to do that, having served on the Planning and Sustainability Commission in Portland for the last 11 years, where we've been dealing with exactly the same long-term planning issues around those crises that Metro gets to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Metro has some additional tools that a body like the Planning Commission doesn't have, and I'm anxious to be able to help with those. I've also served at Metro on both the Metro Policy Advisory Committee and the Transportation Policy Alternatives Committee. So I've got a good grasp of how the policy levers at Metro work. So in addition to my policymaking role at the city, also understand the regional picture. I believe that makes me an ideal candidate for Metro at this time. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And I believe Therese Bottomley is also joining us. Mary, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and why you're running?
Happy to do that. Good to see you, Helen. Good to be connected with you, Andrew and Therese, even though we can't see you. And welcome, Chris.
There we go.
Metro, hi, Therese. Metro has a unique role and some unique authorities. It is the glue that holds the region together. And it is assuming a bigger and bigger role in that, because we do have issues and opportunities that cross county lines, that don't stay neatly within city jurisdictions, and that require a collective response and a collective vision moving forward. That's exactly the kind of thing I have done in both public executive service, public elected service, and running a private business, as well as running a couple of nonprofits. And what I do is create an atmosphere, create a process, create a welcoming environment where people with very different perspectives on issues, problems, opportunities can share those ideas, commit to getting to understand the other perspectives, and work through a collaborative way of finding a solution. That work has resulted in a number of things over the years. The creation of the Clean Rivers program with the city of Portland, in which we cleaned up the Willamette River and the Columbia Slough. I didn't stay in the position through the full implementation of it, but I created the plan, bringing together industries that had point source pollution, representatives of ratepayers, representatives of low-income people, and finding a solution that would have long-lasting effects, probably 50 years worth of effects. At the legislature, I chaired the land use committee when we rewrote and updated the state's land conservation and development laws. A lot of competing interests there, and in a pretty, in a cauldron that was a bit more partisan than the Metro Council, but represented people from all over the state whose local constituencies had very different points of view. And I worked with my co-chair, Bruce Hanna, who was on the committee with me. He was the minority leader at the same time that I was majority leader. And we had a collaborative development. We didn't agree on everything. And we passed a package that Bruce didn't support parts of. But perspectives were aired, information was shared, compromises were made. And that's the way I approach the Metro Council. There are big issues. Chris framed them as crises, and I respect that we are at pivotal points. And there are very challenging issues in front of us. I want to look at it, though, as the opportunities we have to redirect or reconfigure the way the region works together. And I have a long and widely respected track record of bringing together people, finding solutions that not everybody agrees with all parts of, but that work for the collective good. I see the Metro Council as a legislative body. We're not the executive. We don't implement the programs. We have to be smart enough to frame them in the full context of the region. We have to be inviting enough to have honest, open conversations and negotiations with all parties. And we have to close deals. That's what I'm good at. That's what I want to bring to Metro.
Great, thank you. Let's see. I'd like to start off with this question, and I think what we'll do is we'll alternate who goes first. So Mary, I'm going to ask you this first. Metro's role in the region has grown significantly in just the past few years. There's the housing affordability bond, the homeless services measure, as well as now the transportation measure on the November ballot. What role do you think Metro should be playing? Like, where do you see them 5 years from now?
I think Metro, with its current responsibilities, is probably about where it should be in terms of the issues that are germane to a regional government. Some collaboration and transportation gets a little into this, but I think because the airshed is also porous and doesn't respect county lines, some role between Metro and the state around air quality is also an appropriate potential. I'm not sure it should be an authority, but it should be a role that Metro steps up to. The way Metro fulfills those responsibilities should be, and in the past has been, to create the framework, to bring the parties together, to really expose the issues, to create conversations that allow all possibilities to be considered. I think Metro also needs to help the region think outside the box, think beyond the way we've addressed things conventionally. I also think, because Metro has both of its own ambition and because community leaders have asked it to, particularly with the homeless services measure, taken on additional responsibilities. I think Metro really cannot be just a bill collector, just a tax collector, and have a sort of rote distribution of those funds. I think Metro has a responsibility to the voters to establish benchmarks, to define the outcomes that will be delivered if the voters approve or renew tax structures for specific services. Kurt Schrader, who was the Senate co-chair with me as a House co-chair of the Ways and Means Committee in Salem, set up exactly that kind of a system where there were measurable real life outcomes, not how many meetings did we have or how many constituents did we serve, but how many patients had their health improved, how many in agriculture, for example, how many food processing plants reduced their number of infractions, outcomes that actually affect people. And I am eager to bring that kind of perspective to the Metro Council.
Great, thank you. Chris, same question for you. Metro's role in the region has expanded significantly over the past few years. Where do you see it headed in the next 5 years?
So I think we need to recognize that the big shift recently has been the move into housing. And as Mary points out, that's really been at the request of the region, that it's simply not efficient to tackle either affordable housing or homelessness at a city by city scale or county by county scale. We need to do this as a region, and Metro has been asked by the local governments and by the voters to take that on. That is a new policy area. Metro needs to develop expertise. I agree with Mary that we shouldn't just be the tax collector. Metro has a great ability to be the convener, to be the analyzer, to share best practices across jurisdictions and make sure we spend the dollars that the voters have entrusted us with both efficiently and well, that achieves good outcomes. Transportation's an interesting area. It's not really new. Metro has always been a significant player in transportation as the body that basically controls how the federal transportation dollars flow into the region. The new step, which in some ways is not a new step, is the ballot measure that we're looking at this fall. When I served on TPAC 15 years ago, we were trying to figure out what a regional transportation investment measure would look like and how to build political support around it. So this is not a new question. It's in some ways disappointing that it's taken us this long to get together and have a consensus package. And I give Metro leadership and the task force that assembled this package a lot of credit, as I do the Get Moving or the Getting There Together coalition that helped shape the package into the form it is. So as a direct funder of transportation projects, that is a new role for Metro, but I think Metro has always had the responsibility to make sure that things are funded well. In terms of additional roles for Metro, I agree with Mary that air quality is an issue we need to be thinking about as a region. I think the other question that is likely to get called at some point during the term of whoever fills this office is Metro's relationship to TriMet. I think people are familiar with the fact that Metro has the ability by majority vote of council to take over TriMet. We faced the question in other debates about whether that should happen or not. TriMet needs to step up to a bigger role in the region, moving more people, particularly in response to the necessity of climate change and the need for all of us to have fewer drive-alone auto trips in order to be successful at reducing our greenhouse gases. We haven't seen that vision at TriMet yet, and I think a valid question is, how does Metro prod TriMet into stepping up to that? I hope it's something short of a full takeover, but we need to keep everything on the table to make sure we get to the place where our transportation system is a lot more sustainable.
Sorry, this is Therese Bottomley. Because of my conflict on TriMet, I think I'm going to duck out at this point. Thank you.
Okay. So actually, I would like to get into the TriMet question a little bit more. And you were saying something short of a full takeover. What would trigger that for you, Chris?
Well, so I think two issues. One is where the accountability is. So right now, the TriMet board is appointed from Salem, not from the region. So in some ways, a state senator from Southern Oregon has more say about who's on the TriMet board than the citizens of the region do. I think that's problematic. I think we need a TriMet board that is in some way appointed by a regional authority. It could be the Metro Council. I guess there are models in which maybe you elect the TriMet board. I'm not settled on what the right model is, except that it should be accountable to the region, not to Salem. And then there's the question of what does our transit system look like? One of my core beliefs is that in order to effectively address climate change, there have to be fewer drive-alone auto trips. That's one of the big levers in the short term that we can achieve to reduce our greenhouse gases significantly. The transportation sector is 42% of the greenhouse gases in the region, and those are rising rather than falling. So it's pretty clear that there need to be fewer drive-alone auto trips and a much more expansive and frequent bus system. We can't build rail fast enough to build our way out of climate change. So while I support the Southwest Corridor Light Rail Project as part of a 50 or 100-year frame of how we transform our transportation system, in the short term, the only thing that's going to effectively change mode share is to deploy a lot more bus service. TriMet does not have a vision of how to do that. They haven't identified that as a priority. I think that's a significant failing. There are planning tools that Metro has that could point the way on that. But if TriMet's not responsive to that, then you know, a takeover is one other element in the toolbox that we might be forced to use.
And Mary, what about you? What should the relationship be between Metro and TriMet?
I think the relationship should be one of collaboration of equals. Metro is an interesting governance structure itself, still the only one of its kind in the country where you have a directly elected regional government. TriMet is not elected, it's appointed by the governor because of its statewide significance, serving the largest the metropolitan area in the state, and having an impact on such a significant number of Oregonians. Similar to the Port of Portland Commission, Port of Coos Bay, and other regional commissions that are appointed by the governor, subject, as Chris alludes to confirmation by the Senate. I wouldn't characterize it the way he did, that one senator has more say than the Portland region, but I don't want to quibble about that. I think Metro can use its authority that it already has through the JPAC program and other collaborations and other grant making to work with TriMet to do what I had talked about there, to help think outside the box, to help think of TriMet as not just a bus company, but as a connecting service that connects people to work, school, play, shopping, worship. And if we nudge toward that direction, where it isn't just fixed line routes, really fixed in the case of light rail lines and the West Side Express, and less fixed, but still, you know, they're flexible. Bus routes can move, but every day they follow the same path. That's a 19th century and 20th century way of looking at public transportation services. And I think Metro can encourage TriMet with some cajoling and also some stick in the form of revenue sharing or grant making to look at themselves as a bigger role, in a bigger role. I agree with Chris on that, but I'd approach it from, how do we get TriMet to think of having the ambition that the residents of the metro area, of the TriMet service area, love their transit service, feel pride in it, feel a sense of ownership, look to it as something they are eager to use. We're not there now. Changing safety, comfort, convenience, frequency, all good things. Changing some of the ways we do business. Why not have TriMet become a competitor to Lyft and Uber, where it coordinates short haul trips that don't easily fit in with a fixed route schedule. And I would like to see that happen on a collaborative basis rather than in a hostile takeover.
So just to clarify a little bit more, when you're talking about thinking outside the box and, you know, connecting people, not thinking of themselves as a bus company, you know, is it looking into these other kind of new arrangements, such as a competitor to an Uber or Lyft? Or I guess if you can kind of expand a little bit more in terms of what you mean about, you know, ways that TriMet can operate outside of the box.
Exactly. There's no reason TriMet couldn't. TriMet already provides a specialized, very narrowly focused, point-to-point service typically for disabled customers, for disabled transit riders, where individuals are picked up at their starting point, taken to a medical appointment, a group session, a job. I don't see any reason that TriMet couldn't expand that service to help people who would otherwise perhaps have to spend, an hour taking a ride downtown and then transferring to go out another spoke of the radial, and instead cut the trip short and do it in a way that there used to be jitney services, where it wouldn't be a single passenger. I agree with Chris that single passenger rides, even if they're provided by TriMet, aren't as efficient as pick up 3 or 4 people in a neighborhood who are all going kind of close to each other and provide that service. TriMet has the dispatch capacities already. TriMet has some of the fleet that it would need. It would probably need to pick up some additional fleet. TriMet could also be looking at working collaboratively with Metro to electrify, to really electrify the system for private vehicles. Build and operate electric vehicle charging stations that are truly everywhere, so that they can be, so that passenger vehicles, freight, small haul delivery vans and things like that can truly be electrified and remove the emissions that way. I'm thinking, I've put some thought into this, but those are some of the examples that I would like Metro and TriMet to be working on.
If I could follow up on that, the nature of mobility is changing. We have Uber and Lyft are basically a function of new communications technologies through our cell phones, where you can aggregate demand in a way that you never could in the past. So the sort of the communications piece of mobility is changing. We're also seeing the technology of moving people around changing. So we have new lightweight entrants like scooters and e-bikes that are providing a very energy efficient way for people to get around, often more convenient. So both TriMet and Metro need to be looking at the changing landscape. And of course, we're going to have autonomous vehicles, some degree of autonomous vehicles entering the picture as well, where you don't even potentially need a driver. That's going to change the face of mobility as well. So, TriMet and Metro need to be collaborating on how we can best take advantage of these new technologies and approaches in weaving together a complete transportation system for the region, because it's pretty clear it's not going to have just one component. It's not going to be just bus or just rail or just driving in a car. There are going to be a lot of opportunities for different forms of mobility, and then connecting them in different ways to serve your trip needs.
Great, thank you. I'd like to move on to the transportation measure on the November ballot. And I think this question goes first to Mary. Do you think this is the right measure to put in front of voters at this time? And if you can explain your reasons for why or why not.
It's interesting the way you framed that, Helen. Is this the right measure? It's not a perfect measure. And there are things I wish had been incorporated, and I look forward to adjusting should the measure pass and I be elected to the council. There are some very good things about it. There's a strong emphasis on transit investments. There's a strong emphasis on safety measures, vehicle safety measures, pedestrian safety measures, bicyclist safety measures. All of those are good. Metro was very intentional about including as significant voices and influencers, leaders from communities of color, in identifying needs to remediate past exclusions or past arrogant decisions to disrupt you know, the I-5 freeway through the Albina community, for example, but there are other examples. And I admire and love all of those aspects. In my mind, it falls short on addressing climate change. The measure by Metro's own analysis, they claim that it reduces greenhouse gases, but it is essentially rounding error. And for the level of investment in this measure, I think that's an inadequate result to have. I think there could be ways to improve that if it is, if the voters approve the measure, and I would work on that. I am not persuaded that the measure does as much as it should for freight through times, for speeding up freight, particularly freight traffic around and through the region. And some of that is highway related, but I think it's not just highways. It's certainly not just lane miles. It's designing your highways, particularly around the Rose Quarter, in ways that take advantage of new technologies, human factors design, for example, congestion pricing or other traffic mitigation or metering mechanisms. And so those are things that I wish had been in the measure. The other thing I wish had been done as Metro had developed the measure is that it had brought more clarity to the mechanisms for achieving those investments, i.e. how we would pay for it, with a lot more diligence on the analysis up front. We saw that at the very last minute, in fact, the day that the council referred the measure to the ballot, they were still making changes to the language in the ballot. I understand that things were still evolving and the clock was ticking, and you know, I don't want to do too much Monday morning quarterbacking, but that's a concern. And we've recently found that the language that was put in could be interpreted more expansively. And I'm concerned that puts Metro on the defensive around issues of transparency. I don't think it was an intentional omission, and I don't think it was an attempt to be slick about something and slip something in, but I think it was a lack of due diligence.
So will you support it, or do you support it?
That's a different question. That question is, because it is in front of us, me as a voter, and I vote the whole ticket. My question then is not, is this the right measure, but are the benefits, are the good things, are the, is the inclusion that was baked into it enough to outweigh the disadvantages? And on that question, I come down with a imperfect measure, but the good parts outweigh the bad parts, and I am going to vote for it.
Great, thank you. Chris, same question for you. The transportation measure on the ballot, is this the right measure to put in front of voters at this time?
So let me divide that in two. First, the measure itself, and then the timing, which I think is in some ways what the campaign is going to hinge on. So I supported this measure and testified in front of the Metro Council, urging them to refer it. So I will be voting yes, and I'm urging people to vote yes. You know, it is not the exact package that I would have designed. I would have looked for something that was a little bit climate friendlier. You know, as Mary says, this set of investments on its own is essentially carbon neutral. I believe that when it is coupled with additional policies like a regional congestion pricing program, it will actually be climate positive because the investments here bake in alternative choices for people to make and how they get around. So it will make transit more easily able to navigate around traffic congestion. It builds out the bicycle network. It adds sidewalks in places that have lacked them for a long time. So there's a lot of good stuff in this package. And really, when I evaluate the package, I'm thinking about, what does it do for regional mobility and, the impact mobility has on the economy? What does it do for climate? What does it do for equity? What does it do for safety? In climate, this is so-so, but I think ultimately positive. On the other three, I think it's a big step forward. I mean, as I mentioned, for 15 years, I've been involved in conversations on when we get a regional investment measure. And we have to give credit to the people who pulled this together that we've gotten there, which is something we hadn't done for the last 15 years. But the huge improvements in equity and safety are very compelling to me. The fact that it was, BIPOC organizations that had a huge voice in shaping the investments, the fact that the investments are, and the majority happening in areas of the region that have traditionally been underinvested in transportation, is a big step forward. Now the question is, should we be doing this in the middle of a recession driven by a pandemic, right? Which is, I think, the argument that the opposition campaign will make is this is not good timing. I think we need to look at a longer time scale than the 1 or 2 years that this recession will be with us. And, hopefully by next year we have a vaccine and we're beginning to come out of the pandemic. But even if you're worried about the economy, transportation measures are traditionally very good stimulus. These projects will create good family wage jobs and will help stimulate the economy. The additional mobility provided will help stimulate the economy. So I think I could make a very credible argument that this is an anti-recessionary policy and that voters should pass it to help get out of the recession and not be too worried about the fact that we may be adopting it in the middle of a recession. I would say in terms of how we fund it, I think Metro Council basically because of the timing of the homeless services measure, then this measure, they got backed into the least bad option for funding it in terms of a payroll tax. I prefer we found other ways. One suggestion I've made is that we have $30 million a year allocated by the legislature to the Rose Quarter Freeway expansion, a project that I think the community has been crystal clear that they don't see any benefit from and in fact find to be destructive. If we could lobby the legislature to dedicate that $30 million to this package, it would take something like, instead of a 0.75 payroll tax, it would be something like a 0.66. So,
but is that realistic? I mean, you're asking the state, which in 2017 passed this massive transportation package that got buy-in from around the state. I mean, how realistic is it to say, hey, state, instead of this project that is critical to people in Southern Oregon. This is critical to people throughout the Oregon economy. Let's park it here. How realistic is that as an alternative?
So I think, in fact, it is not critical to the state's economy. What we know is that when you expand freeway lanes in an urban area, you just get induced demand, and within a couple of years, you have exactly as much congestion as you had at the beginning, if not more. So the benefit that's touted for the project isn't real. The negative impacts on the community of expanding the freeway into a school and into a park, the Esplanade, are very, very real, and the community both the general community and the African American community have been very clear that they don't see benefit from this project. So I think we could credibly go back to the state, and indeed Metro President Lynn Peterson suggested this in sort of a compromise she was trying to broker with the business community, is that we go to the state together to lobby for state funding to achieve part of this package. I think putting the $30 million for Rose Quarter on the table would be a very effective way of doing that.
I do want to get into just, what you've just discussed about regarding businesses and coming forward with this measure in the middle of a pandemic. One of the big concerns which Mary mentioned was that there's this exemption where government agencies aren't subject to this. How defensible do you think that decision was by the Metro Council to go forward with this with very little discussion at the meeting to all of a sudden exempt about 10% of the labor force? And actually this question goes first to Chris.
Yeah, I think it's a fair criticism, and I think it goes to what I mentioned, that the council was kind of backed into this revenue mechanism. I think with the benefit of hindsight, if they had been able to forecast a little earlier that this is where they would wind up, that clearly those terms could have been better spelled out and have less ambiguity. I think the council's pretty committed to making sure the implementation of this is fair. You know, the measure provides the authority for a payroll tax up to 0.75%. Council's indicated they're likely to start at a lower rate and gradually raise it. I think council's also been clear that even though some people have expressed the concern that it gives them additional authority to do things like tax benefits, they're not going to do that. So I think once the measure is adopted, council can very clearly set the implementing legislation to clarify all those issues. But of course, you know, if you allow your opponents the ability to poke at your ambiguity, they're going to do that. And I think we'd be better off trying to pass this if that had been cleared up on the front end rather than afterwards. But it is what it is.
So, you know, one of the other criticisms is that there's no ending date on the tax. Would you vote then both to kind of lower the, if you're elected to the council and this passes, to both lower the payroll tax in the beginning years as well as put an ending date on this? And make it clear that it's not covering full compensation, that it's solely payroll.
So yes to the first two parts of that. I would basically, I'm in alignment with the current council to start at 0.6 instead of 0.75 and to be clear that it covers payroll, not benefits. With regard to an ending date, no, I wouldn't commit to an ending date. I think we need to see how this package plays out and look at the transportation needs in the future. You know, that's a decision that's 10 years away. I'm not going to try and commit the council to what the outcome of something that we'll only have data for in 10 years should be.
Thank you. Mary, same question for you. I'd like you to address the question about the fairness regarding the government exemption, as well as if you're elected to the council, what limitations you would vote for.
I have not done the research to understand part of the conversation that went on at the council session when they approved referring this. There was some exchange between a couple of the council members and Metro's attorney about whether they could tax local government payrolls. I know that TriMet on its payroll tax for its services does, but that's statutorily, the TriMet system for taxation for local payroll taxes is statutorily established. This is different, and there was some uncertainty about whether, because it's different and covered by a different set of statutes and Metro's charter, whether it would be allowed. I'd want to first clarify that. But I do think, I hope that the way I want to approach this and the way I expect I would have had I been serving on the council is way back as the package was being developed, really lay out in crystal clear language what the funding mechanisms might be, what are legal, what are palatable to the voters, which have the most support from the voters, but really precisely. Now, I'm accustomed to working with a legislative revenue office that analyzes this to a very precise level for legislative proposals. I believe Metro has that talent, that professional skill available to it, and I don't know if it was deployed. So I would have started, because that's the way I think. A project needs to be balanced, what you're going to use the revenue for, the services, what it costs, what outcomes you'll achieve, and the funding mechanism, and is it adequate to meet those needs, and how you blend those together, how you mesh them so that they fit. So I want to know, first of all, whether there was or is at this point clarity. Even with clarity, I am a bit concerned about the timing of that decision. It did seem very sudden, wasn't really explained, testimony wasn't taken on it. So I have those concerns. Now to your other questions. If the voters approve the measure and if the vote on implementation occurs after January 1st, which I think it should, since the measure already says that the revenue won't be collected until 2022, I would expect that the new council, there will be 2 new members of the council, this district and District 3. I would expect and hope that that decision would be made with that council that will have responsibility for implementing the measure for the next 4 years. And I would I would lean toward joining in a reduction to begin with. I believe in keeping faith, and the Metro Council, at least 2 members of the Metro Council have indicated that that would be their intention to move that change forward. Your other question was on what's included.
Right.
And I would parse that just a touch. I suspect that the language was drafted the way it was, and this is me surmising. I have not confirmed this with Metro staff or counselors, but I would think that it's possible that the language was crafted the way it was so that it didn't apply just to simple wages, but to executive compensation, like deferred compensation, stock, stock distribution, stock options. And I think those are equivalent to wages and should be subject to taxes. But tax exempt benefits like standard pensions available to everybody or health insurance, I think should be excluded. And I think you could write the language to do that. And on the last point, I'm going to agree with Chris. If the voters approve it, the voters will have approved a new funding source, a new tax revenue stream. And I think there's plenty of time later to put a sunset on it, but at least we need, if the voters approve it, we need to run the program long enough so we can deliver the projects that the voters were voting to approve, that they said as a package they wanted to deliver.
But at the same time, you have a lot of situations where there is a time element, the school bonds, for instance, where they say, we're going to deliver this project within, by selling bonds over this period of time. Why can't that same standard be attached to this measure?
Well, the measure combines both capital and operating programs. It contains capital projects, most notably the Southwest Corridor light rail line, and those have a fixed construction period. And that's the part of it that's comparable to a school bond measure or a hospital bond measure that some jurisdictions in Oregon approve because they're public authorities. But it also includes a number of operating program services, the youth pass, some of the pedestrian services, some of the bicyclist services that are in fact ongoing. And because of that combination, I think maybe the appropriate decision at a later date when we see how progress on completing the capital projects goes would be to lower the rate and just cover the program services. And then if there are new capital projects to go forward in 7 or 8 years, then we could consider going back to the voters for those. But if the voters approve the programs, which are ongoing, I don't think we should pull the plug on that.
I would echo that. You know, Youth Pass is something that I've been championing for the better part of a decade, and I certainly wouldn't want to see that sunset. I think it's also worth mentioning what the other revenue option on the table was, which was an auto registration fee. I know certainly the time I've been in Oregon, when registration fees have gone up, they've never sunsetted and gone back down. And of course, the reason that the registration fee was rejected is that it's fundamentally regressive. So, you know, you pay the same registration fee whether you're registering a clunker or $75,000 SUV or pickup truck, and that's clearly regressive in terms of the impact it would have on lower income portions of the population. I think council was correct to reject that.
I'd like to move on to just the question of accountability and transparency. There have been a number of things that I think would give voters pause about how Metro operates. Recently, the auditor's office came out with a letter that noted a number of deficiencies in how it's running its affordable housing bond. Noted that there's not even a consistent definition for what constitutes a qualified administrative cost. They also noted a lack of disclosure by people who had potential conflicts of interest who serve on the oversight committee. That, as well as the last minute changes in the homeless services bond or homeless services tax, as well as this the last minute changes exempting government from the transportation measure, understandably raise a lot of questions about how well Metro is doing its job. Chris, I'd like to start with you. How would you ensure that you are helping hold Metro accountable and ensuring that they're transparent with the public about their actions in a real-time manner, as opposed to waiting for an auditor's report?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I'm grateful we have auditors at all levels of our government that provide this kind of feedback. I think the real-time nature of it is part of why we have some of these challenges. You know, the homeless services measure, for example, came together, I think, when needed, but quicker than prudent planning might have called for. But it was responding to, you know, a huge need in the community. The intergovernmental agreements to, you know, implement that are still being worked out. I think, you know, we have faced, in the time I've been on the Planning Commission in Portland, similar issues around declaring potential conflicts on advisory committees. We've learned from that. We do that up front. We're much better about disclosure. Yeah, I think it's a learning experience, but I think we are, as I mentioned, facing crises, and we are facing a crisis. Decisive, quick action may be more important than dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's.
Just to be clear, though, the auditor's letter wasn't referencing the homeless services measure that just passed.
Right, it was the affordable housing measure.
Right, which was, yeah, 2018.
I understand. And in fact, the IGAs for that are still being completed as well. I think the one with the city of Portland is just up for approval now. You know, that measure we had a little more lead time on, so we should probably expect a higher standard on that. But, you know, we're all learning.
So, but I mean, I guess, how would you hold them accountable in a real-time fashion? I mean, I understand, you know, everyone's learning, but presumably when you have a government that's collecting hundreds of millions of dollars, that there would be, you know, a little bit more. I guess I'd like to hear more detail from you about how do you make sure that, you know, fundamental things like what's an administrative cost are dealt with.
Right, and I think that, you know, council members need to be on the alert for those kind of things, call them out as things are being adopted. You know, I've learned, for example, from, you know, my experience in the Planning Commission, where you can get in trouble with people not declaring conflicts. I would hopefully spot that going into a process rather than waiting for those issues to emerge. Yeah.
Do you have like an example of just how you've, just how you go about enforcing a sense of accountability and transparency in any of your positions?
Sure. On the Planning Commission, there have been a number of times when I've called out processes. So, for example, we had a rewrite of the neighborhood contact regulations, which is the situation when there's a new development going on. You know, how do you tell the neighborhood what's going on, solicit their input, and staff came to us with a proposal that basically talked about a very big sign that would be at the building site, which is a good thing. The staff proposal neglected to have any kind of online component. So I pointed out that, well, a sign is great if you have the mobility to get to the place where the sign is and read it, if you have the vision to be able to read the sign, and if you don't have either of those things, then an online tool that people anywhere can access, or people with visual difficulties can access with a screen reader technology, makes it universally applicable. So absent those additions, the policy was fundamentally ableist, and I called that out and we changed the policy. So I think having members of the council who are aware of those kinds of issues, and there are a whole divergent set of ways that that you can be aware of different things, but having diverse council that has people with different life experiences can look at these things is really important to ensuring transparency and accountability.
Thank you. Mary, same question for you. How would you go about ensuring that Metro is upholding principles of transparency and being held accountable on a real-time basis?
This is one of the primary motivations for my being in this race, because I care about how the region develops, and I care about Metro fulfilling its role and its opportunity in really advancing the region collectively. And I have a lot of background in setting measurable outcomes, working with, as I talked about earlier, working with a very diverse, sometimes directly conflicting work group or advisory council or board of directors in sorting out what it is we really expect and what we are going to, how we are going to make sure we achieve it. As a business owner, the way we do that is very clear, written contracts that are a pay for performance basis. You have to be prepared to be blunt up front. This is what we need. If you can't commit to delivering it, we'll find another contractor. That's a little more difficult when you're dealing with cities because there is no other Oregon city to work with. And if the region needs housing in Oregon City, then we need to find a different way to achieve that. But very firm specified outcomes that are objective and that both parties know about and accept upfront. Sometimes included in that, particularly in public contracts, are clawback provisions. If you don't deliver the jobs you claimed you would in order to get either a direct investment from Business Oregon or a tax break in code, then we claw back the benefit you got because you didn't hold up your end of the bargain. I think there are times, particularly in the affordable housing bond measure implementation, where that could be a mechanism. And in particular, that should focus on the developer's fee or the profit from the project, which should come after all the deliverables are delivered. Finally, an example I used in the other way, which is more of an incentive for performance rather than a punishment for lack of performance, when I was vice president at Family Care, and we were recruiting providers, doctors, nurses, labs, hospitals, to provide services for new Medicaid patients. We constructed the reimbursement schedules to incentivize primary preventive care. And if a physician's practice or a lab or other collective was able to deliver improvements in health, which might be a reduction in return visits to a hospital for ER patients, might be progress on smoking cessation, or a very complex list of them, they could earn a bonus because they'd share in the savings that we realized by not having to provide those more expensive acute services because they were doing preventive services. All of those mechanisms, I think, could be looked at as possible choices for helping Metro make sure that we get the results we want. And on the affordable housing bond measure, I raised this early on in the spring, in fact, shortly after I entered the race, that I am really, I'm dissatisfied with the rigor that Metro was applying to those projects. Some of those projects are coming in at unit prices approaching $400,000 for an apartment that's affordable. And the way affordable is designed is that it is a combination of tax credits to offset the construction costs and public vouchers or other payments to reduce the rent. It really hasn't focused on keeping the construction affordable so that the public as a whole, which is writing not all of the check for that construction, but a significant and critical piece, also receives the benefits. The city of Portland just recently on its own housing bond measure sent out information. I don't know if you've seen it. I don't think you've run it. Kind of patting themselves on the back for delivering more than they had promised voters with their bond measure when voters approved it. And that's good, to deliver more units than you had promised. But the units there are also coming in, some of them are coming in at a total cost of around $200,000. But some of them are coming in at $350,000 a unit. I know of people who are developing working family apartments without any subsidy and are finishing their land acquisition, development costs, and developers' fees for under $175,000 a unit. We need to find a way to incorporate those techniques into the projects that Metro is subsidizing, because if we can get those projects to come in total cost at $200,000 instead of $400,000, we can build twice as many. And maybe it's only 80% more, but that's 80% more real human beings who benefit from our rigor. That's the kind of approach I'll take.
Thank you. I hate to give this such a short shrift, but we only have a few minutes left. And I'll start with you, Mary. Metro oversees several entertainment and meeting venues that are unlikely to open for business anytime soon. Closures are costing Metro tens of millions of dollars in lost revenue. What more should Metro do to help shore up its financial position as it works through this pandemic?
Oh. Metro has cut pretty close to the bone already. Several hundred people are still on furlough, probably not coming back for at least a year. Prospects for the venues are, other than the zoo, are they won't see paying events probably till the start of the 21-22 fiscal year. I don't have a magic wand or a big piggy bank that I can help bail Metro out on. I don't have the exact answer, but let me tell you how I would approach it and the kinds of questions I would ask. And that is, we have substantial facilities that the taxpayers in this region have invested in. They built them, they paid for them, they are an asset that belongs to them. We need to make sure, first of all, we preserve that asset so that when we are allowed and able to safely use them, they're still available. There may be alternative uses. You know, during the spring, Metro opened the convention center as a homeless shelter alternative. We're beginning to come back into winter weather that makes it very problematic to have people, particularly people with serious physical illnesses, not to mention mental illnesses, sleeping outdoors in the rain and the wind, possibly in the ice in the wintertime. It's possible that Metro should open the conversation to talk about using both the convention center and other facilities that Metro has as temporary shelters for people during the winter months, through some combination of offering it to the city and county through the joint office, or through Metro's own approved funding for homeless services, which will begin to be collected starting in January. I serve on the board of a performing arts theater, and we are facing a very similar challenge on a much, much smaller scale. Our auditorium only seats 120 people. And what we've done is open our production season to a new way of presenting performing arts. And I don't know if this is feasible for Metro on a large scale, but some kind of subscription-based closed circuit TV or some other videography system that would allow people to use the venue and for Metro to be reimbursed. Probably wouldn't be at the level that a live event, you know, a conference or something like that, but to be creative about how you might convert that space into the backdrop for video programming that is a notch or two above sitting here in our living rooms or offices with not a lot of special effects. So that's the way I'd approach it. What do we need to do to preserve the investments that the public has already made? What creative options do we have? What are other large cities doing in similar circumstances? I'm not at all ashamed of borrowing or stealing or copying successful activities that are going on elsewhere.
Thank you. And Chris, same question for you
Sure.
regarding the venues.
Yeah, so I think the framework of my answer is very similar to Mary's. I'd point out some specific differences and also highlight what Metro's doing. So Metro staff in the budget office right now are looking at rebalancing the budget on a 5-year basis, because the way the reserve funds for the facilities work, some of the actual drops in revenue will take substantial periods of time to ripple through the accounting system. So they're not just looking to fix this year or next year, but to take a 5-year look, and I think that's very appropriate. There are likely to be additional furloughs, other reductions in the venues to basically sustain the amount of time they can keep the assets intact using their reserve funds. The 5-year budget rebalancing will probably include basically taking some of Metro's general fund and subsidizing the performing venues, which will have impacts on the planning program or other core parts of Metro's non-facilities mission. There is some creativity going on. The Expo Center is being used for drive-in movies, for example, so there's a small revenue stream that's coming out of that. But I think there are 2 particular situations for individual venues that need to be looked at. So the Performing Arts Center, the Portland 5, is actually owned by the City of Portland and operated by Metro. So I think the City of Portland needs to be a partner in how that facility is handled and should be bearing some of the responsibility for the budget impacts of that. The other individual case is the Expo Center. That facility is at the end of its life. Metro already has a process in place to look at what the future use of that should be. Should it continue to be an exposition facility? Should it be something else? You know, should it become housing or industrial space? I think it makes sense to accelerate that process, and Metro is taking steps in that direction so that, for example, if it's not going to be, you know, in its current use in the long term, that steps could be taken to get it into a use that would be more productive in the short term. So that definitely bears examination.
Great, thank you. Thank you both for spending the hour with us. I think we're pretty much all set, and if I have any follow-ups, I will call you individually. But again, thank you for the great conversation.
Thanks all.
Great.
Enjoyed it. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Mary.